So we're going to need something of a long introduction for this one. Only once have I ever made an analysis video about real people, because I think it can be unethical, deeply exposing for me to sit here and try to psychoanalyze a real person for all the world to see, not to mention probably quite inaccurate when you haven't even met them, when this isn't my speciality. You know, with fictional characters it doesn't matter if everything isn't perfect accuracy, because the videos are more about just encouraging thought and empathy. But with a real person, that feels different. With my video on Jimmy Savile, I felt there were exceptions and that there was an important purpose to that video, and I think that's the case again today. Different exceptions and different reasons for it, and yet I do have some caveats and explanations. One being that this is going to be a very sensitive topic. Mary Bell was a child who, when 10 years old, killed 2 children aged 4 and 3. It's awful stuff to be talking about. Naturally, a video like this also means discussing Mary's childhood, her trauma, which means topics like SA, as YouTube wishes it to be called, violence and murder. And I will endeavour to talk with as little drama as I can, but if this video feels too much, that's absolutely fine. The second point there being that we're not here to glamorise any of that or sensationalise the way that can sometimes happen uncomfortably with true crime. You know, whilst these events took place in the 60s, these are very real people with families who lost a son, a brother, a friend, people still grieving, and I don't think that should be forgotten in this. And I suppose in the context of those people, it's important I also stress that making a video about Mary Bell's psychology, or any such topic about how a child can come to kill someone or might kill someone, none of that is an excuse for their actions. None of that is meant to dampen the very real grief and anger those affected might still be feeling. Often people have an idea that trying to understand means dismissing what was wrong, excusing the behaviour, and it absolutely should not mean that. Even for Mary's sake, I think facing up to the reality of what she did without excuse or denial is important. The fact is, children, though thankfully rare, do sometimes kill, and the better as a society we can understand why with empathy rather than glorification. Not only can we prevent such things happening in the future, but also these are deeply traumatised and disturbed children who weren't born evil, whose lives weren't doomed to head in that direction of murder, who could have grown up into pretty healthy, happy people with the right support early enough, which, strangely, despite again some caveats, is largely what happened to Mary Bell. Which is the final thing to remember. Mary Bell is a real person, still alive today, someone who will live the rest of her life with various regulations and a probation officer, but has been living within the community under a false identity. She has a loving, healthy relationship with her partner. She has raised a healthy child for which she is said to be a very good, somewhat surprisingly good mother by the people and the experts who know them. A daughter who now has a child herself too. These are all real families. Both those of the children she killed, Martin Brown and Brian Howe, as well as the family of Mary herself. It does kind of bother me when I look at other videos on YouTube about Mary Bell. Some of them seem good, don't get me wrong, but there seems to be a general assumption that she's a psychopath, incapable of compassion or remorse. Anyone she seems close to must be an act of manipulation. She can't be a good mother, she must have fooled the experts. You know, based on what she did and based on what we know of many other famous killers, just then joining up those dots. And even at the time of Mary's trial, a psychologist labelled her as a psychopath, which is quite shocking because you can't accurately diagnose a child with something like that. You're not meant to, because a child's brain is still massively developing. Whilst there are certainly other diagnoses or indicators you could point out that might lead to them then becoming a psychopath in later life, they may also not, especially with the right support given early enough. Half the world seems set on labelling her either evil or a psychopath with the faint implication of evil, with little interest to try and understand further. And equally, there is another half of people that take the view Mary was just a child, almost as though she's completely innocent and should be totally excused, which, as we'll see, even for Mary's sake, it should not be excused, I don't think is the word. It's not as simple as that. In truth, this video won't be so much my analysis as most of my other ones are. The bulk of this will be drawing from the insights already set out in the book Cries Unheard, Why Children Kill, written by Gitta Sereny. A book, it would seem, a lot of the Mary Bell YouTube videos, I don't know, I'm not sure if they know much about beyond the Wikipedia page. Gitta Sereny was a writer and journalist who was there in the 60s at the trial of Mary Mary Bell and Norma Bell, who then wrote a book about A, the strangeness of a child being tried in an adult court, and B, how little concern the system gave for why or how a child or children could kill, instead interested solely on who did it and what the punishment should be. And it was a book Mary Bell avoided until she was 24. Finally reading a few extracts and discovering, that a lot of this book was true tellings about her life. And then, much later into her 30s, having turned down offer after offer from various newspapers or writers wanting to tell her story, the Sun even offering as much as $250,000, she instead eventually got in contact with Gitta Sereny with the idea to discuss everything with her. Mainly it seems to try and wrap her head around what she did herself, as well as the hope that if a book of sorts was finally released, the press might leave her alone. And that is how the book reads. It's not so much a story as an account of the week's worth of recorded transcripts from interviews, ones that discuss all of her life, the trial, the secure unit she was sent to, then prison, then life beyond it, her childhood, and eventually the deep distress with which she attempts to discuss the killings themselves. I need to say this now because when I quote sections later, there won't be that context. It is not a book designed to excuse Mary and paint her in some pure light. It is not a sensationalist book either. I think the only way this book could work is the way it's written. An account of Mary's attempt with Gitta Sereny to try and understand why she did what she did, to make sense of it. For a child who spent most of the following years in total denial that she committed those crimes, not just reaching a place where she can admit to it, can feel the guilt, but can really seek to understand it. That is quite a powerful step. One that I think begins with Gitta herself initially quite sceptical that she might just be getting manipulated here. I don't think that is the case though. There'll be no sponsor segment from Wild Anvil today, I know you're all disappointed. Potentially no intro or end screen. I'll see how I feel when I come to editing this. The calmness that provides might be necessary in a video like this, or it might feel jarring, I'm not sure. Otherwise, we're just gonna begin now. Mary Bell grew up in 1950s and 60s Newcastle Upon Tyne in a particularly impoverished area called the Scotswoods, where, despite the extreme stresses of poverty, which will no doubt play some hand in a lot of this story, I don't think we should forget that, the community of the neighbourhood was a close one. Everybody knew everybody, which gave the area on White House Road some general feeling, or maybe illusion, but feeling of safety. And it meant most of the adults there played some role in caring for children who weren't even theirs, and as a result, strange as it seems with culture today, it was entirely common for children as young as 3 or 4 to just go out playing around the neighbourhood, totally unsupervised by the parents, just head out for the day and then at some point return for tea. Mary was the second child of Betty, although it also seems confused. I've read that she was the first child too. Her father was entirely unknown, however. Betty met and later married a man called Billy Bell when Mary was just a few months old. A man she believed for all of her childhood was her father, and a man who made his living from armed robbery. As such, he was often away, and sometimes in prison, where Betty made her money as a sex worker, often travelling to Glasgow out on business as they called it. When she went to Glasgow, Billy would often come back to look after the children, but not always. Mary had a younger brother as well as 2 sisters who quite quickly ended up living almost permanently with Mary's aunt, Audrey, in her spotless house. It's not entirely clear why. Audrey was immaculate, said Mary. I was ashamed to go over there. Denise, her daughter, was always well turned out. I always thought Audrey was bothered that I would get lice on Denise. My brother and I were alone for days, weeks, it seemed to me. In that sense, when their parents were both away, Mary and her brother were mostly left to wander about, either getting some care from Audrey, going back to their own home alone, or visiting other neighbours. And whether or not the point about head lice is true, it's evident that Mary felt that she didn't exactly belong with her aunt and her 2 other sisters that were taken in there. Why that is would be a very interesting question. Really, this section section of the video is to do with Norma Bell. No relation, they just happen to have the same surname. She was a couple of years older than Mary, and when she moved into the area, the two soon became friends. Norma was also on trial for the killings, first of Martin Brown, from which she was rightly acquitted. She wasn't there when it happened, and then Brian Howe, where she was equally acquitted on the grounds A, that Mary carried out the killing, Norma was either a bystander or not there. The court itself appears a little confused in some of the specifics there, and B, she was deemed mentally much weaker than Mary and therefore had been manipulated into it. Which, if we're to take Gitta Sereny's account, doesn't entirely add up. For example, at the second trial, Brian, he was strangled to death at 3 years old, and afterwards the letter N was cut into his stomach with a razor. And then afterwards, in a different hand, the letter was changed into M, according to forensics. So, unless there was a totally unwitnessed third person, that would suggest Norma was, at the very least, more than just an innocent bystander. Similarly, the transcripts from the original police interviews show Norma lying about various points we know to be false, and with a level of ability that doesn't quite add up with the mental weakness she was concluded to have. I think that was the phrase. And that's not necessarily the case, but it's certainly a question the book raises, and I'm relaying it now. Thirdly, we have Mary's own account much later in life, as well as other mentions to suggest that their friendship was not totally one-sided, with Mary as a complete manipulator. And there's possibly some truth to that. There are events with which Norma seemed to take the initiative, such as convincing Mary to run away with her, something Mary had never done, whereas Norma had. Norma knew if they stole enough money for a bus ticket, there was a man in South Shields who had a house they could stay at. All of which remains open-air speculation, none of which is to say Mary is less guilty. No, she was absolutely guilty on both occasions. And as I said, in the event of the first killing, Norma wasn't even present. Mary led the child Martin into a derelict building before strangling him to death. The point of me detailing this about Norma, I think, is to recognise the kind of relationship Mary had with her. After Martin's death, Mary remembers going to find Norma. I told Norma right away I had killed Martin, and Norma said, "You didn't. You didn't. Show me." The point is, the two have a relationship of daring each other, dares to do dangerous things where one person suggests it and the other doesn't want to seem a coward, increasingly dangerous things, and then increasingly naughty things is the phrase Mary uses in the interviews. Gitta writes a little bit of how Mary's speech can become ever so slightly more childlike when she's forced to think back on the traumatic years, and she ends up sort of speaking in the present tense when it feels most distressing to her. "I was a dare-me child," she said. "I wanted to... You see, when you were a child, I used to think I could be in a sort of Jesse James gang, you know? Ride a horse and break someone out of prison by wrapping a rope around the bars and getting the horse to run off. Drag in the bars like I saw in westerns I watched with my dad on TV. And was Norma that sort of dare-me child too? Not in the same way, no, not at all. But she was a fighter. She picked fights with coloured kids. I don't know where she got that from, but she didn't like them." This being a belief Mary herself didn't share. Now, I think it was only to get attention, like me, though not like me. As I know now, I needed attention from some adult to get me away from my family. With her, I think it was probably the opposite. She just wanted a family to notice her. It feels really strange to me, narrating out transcript dialogue like that. There are two aspects you might notice here though. As Mary herself explains quite articulately, as I said, a lot of this particular video will actually just be me relaying the information given. The first aspect is this exciting sort of attitude of increasing dares, where it's terrifying how out of control that can become, but also sort of thrilling for them, it seems. These are two children who, long before the killings, very clearly felt out of control within themselves and didn't know how to control it or stop it, and that terror likely somewhat was worked into an excitement instead. I think a game of dares somewhat diminishes the reality of the situation and makes it feel less serious, more a fun game. It becomes easier to lose themselves within the fantasy side of it all. First they're daring each other to walk on the pipes over the Tyne Bridge, then there's little bits of stealing or pushing a child down an embankment, to then start fantasizing about murder, not as a serious thing, not as something where somebody truly dies, but just as this strange taboo act in the mind of children. And don't get me wrong, that's not to say this is innocent, simple stuff or anything like that. The fact this is even a part of their behaviour suggests much deeper feelings already, but this is a good starting place for discussion. And the second aspect's there wanting to be caught, wanting to be arrested, wanting to be taken away from her family in Mary's case. We'd do more and more dangerously naughty things. We kept hoping we'd be arrested and sent away. It was all I wanted. Wanting to be taken away from the family will make a lot of sense when we get to the next section of this video. Otherwise, as exciting as it might have felt on one level when they disconnected from reality, made it a game, they also feel out of control. They'd also want it to stop. They just don't quite know how to make that happen. And with some great leap of conjecture from me, I could perhaps speculate they wanted people to take seriously how awful they felt. The community to see them as bad and evil as they might have felt about themselves inside, and therefore then some relief to be recognised for that badness finally. The shame, yes, but also some idea of relief there. Here is the proof. I am a monster, I knew it. This was where I was meant to end up. One of the most tragic aspects of this is how it could have been stopped or helped countless times before the deaths of Martin Brown and Brian Howe. Mary and Norma would get in trouble with the police, sometimes deliberately to be arrested, and the police would do nothing, take nothing seriously. No one else would. This was the 60s, and this was a community that took care of their own. That meant they were suspicious of police and social workers who were reluctant to go in too often. Teachers did nothing when Mary attempted to strangle a child in a sand pit, holding her throat and also stuffing sand into her mouth, which is incredibly traumatic for the child. But what happened about it? After the first death of Martin Brown, Mary told her friend Norma about it because they had this pact that they were meant to do everything together. They'd already been fantasizing about ideas of murder, but Mary said they couldn't tell anyone about this, and yet she also needed to. She told several people. She and Norma even broke into the nursery and left notes confessing to the killing. It's certainly not the only motivation here, confession. I think there are several, and one aspect is this conflict between wanting to be arrested and also the terror of it, combined, I think, with the almost romanticised ideas of her criminal father, someone she probably saw exactly like Jesse James, especially growing up in a community where authority, I think for understandable reasons, was despised. My mother never referred to anybody in authority without the F word. This was a child growing up very anti-authority, partly idealising her father for that. Breaking the law might have felt like a level of confused solidarity with her father, her own pact there with him. And the murder notes very clearly taunt the police in that way, saying things like, "I murder so that I may come back. F off, we murder, watch out. We did murder Martin Brown. F off, you bastard." There's then maybe an attempt also to turn it into something heroic, triumphant, something that gives them power at the least, and yet also a desire to be stopped. The problem is the police didn't take the note seriously. Nobody believed Mary either when she said she was the killer, partly because Martin was originally wrongly deemed an accidental death, but I also think because her mother had gone to great lengths to brand Mary as a liar already. Everybody in the neighbourhood saw the things Mary said as lies, brags, falsities. Her mother had a very clear reason for wanting people to see Mary as a liar, something we will get to. And also, sometimes children just do lie or certainly exaggerate, where the rationality of what happens and the emotions they felt kind of blur. It's very common with traumatised children to lie, sometimes as a coping mechanism or a stress response, but that doesn't mean there isn't some truth in it if you take the time to dig down. It's tragic because this book is called Cries Unheard, in the sense of these traumatised children who cry out for help long before they're driven to the breaking point of murder. But nobody does hear them when it's needed. In this example, the horrible, bitter fact that Mary quite literally cried out and was still ignored. Perhaps had those notes been taken seriously, the second child, Brian Howe, might have lived. That's quite impactful. But we need to discuss the heaviest aspects now. There's no avoiding them. I explained to Mary that her Aunt Kath had told me the first thing Betty had said when they tried to put the baby in her arms was, "Take the thing away from me." Kath had said you were the bonniest baby. Well, said Mary, her voice hard, that's when they should have taken me away from her forever, shouldn't they? Betty Bell is an interesting person throughout the course of Mary's life. Ever since Mary's arrest, though, there was a dramatic element to Betty. All throughout the trial, where Dormer's family would sit silent and grave, or in the breaks attempt to comfort and cheer up their daughter, Betty is described as constantly wailing, screaming, storming out in objection only to return again shortly afterwards. The word Mary uses is hysterical, and at the same time not really comforting or speaking to her daughter at all. As early as the trial, she was meeting with reporters from the press to try and sell a story. Later, constantly selling them after every meeting with her daughter, news about the secure unit she was sent to, her concerns about the prison, anything. She sent letters or poems to the newspapers that she claimed were written by her daughter. One that even in Gitta Sereny's first book, everybody believed was written by Mary. And it seems various other documentaries and videos I've watched still quote this poem as written by Mary.
Please, ma'am, put my tiny mind at ease. Tell judge and jury on your knees, they will listen to your cry of pleas. The guilty one is you, not me.
When based on Mary's account, based on some, it seems, solid evidence of the writing style and the handwriting, Betty wrote this, along with an entire drawer full of fake letters and poems they found in her house after Betty died. One motive for this was obviously money, particularly at a period in Betty's life when she was incredibly poor. Newspapers offer good money, and part of the sensationalist aspect perhaps is because that's what the papers want. Sensationalism. But I also think, and this is just my vague speculation now, so take it with a grain of salt, that is that an aspect of presenting herself as a victim here, as if saying, I am the poor, poor mother who happens to have a murderer for a daughter. We know of Gitta Sereny's first book that shone a light on some of Betty's parenting, or lack of, that Betty hated that book, insisted Mary should never read it, that it was all lies, went to the extent of visiting bookshops and libraries just to turn the copies of the book around the wrong way so that no one could see what they were. Also, interestingly, on the sparse occasions where Betty went to visit Mary at the Red Bank Secure Unit, there would always be some illness she had. She said she had a toothache. It was her pattern. She always had something, or said she had something, that would make me be sorry for her, or guilty about her. There are many accounts, even as early as the trial, where Betty would hit Mary and scold her for the grief she has caused her poor mother. Not the murders themselves, or why did you do it or anything, just look how grief-stricken you've made me. She would tell me how sad she was, about how she was always writing to the Prime Minister, and not to worry, she'd get me out. And I would ask about my sisters, and she would say that I'm the only one that matters. I've got enough on my plate because of what happened to you. I can't look after the others. So I thought that it was my fault too that the kids had no mum. There's two reasons for detailing this. One is it paints a picture that Betty had always shamed Mary. In fact, there are many heavier quotes of calling her vile, disgusting, evil, many of which were said before Mary killed Martin O'Brien. She also seems an incredibly cold personality, and the accounts of those who supervised her visits with Mary suggested that they didn't really talk about anything. It was banal, expressed little, went nowhere, a lack of connection. Then Betty would instead talk with the staff or just leave. In the words of one probation officer, Betty has always been very good at making Mary feel guilty and worthless, isolating her from the rest of the family and squeezing her dry emotionally. The second reason is, of course, why would a mother feel such intense need to so very strenuously and dramatically present herself as a victim? Even before the first book was published, that some would criticise Betty and probably would have felt incredibly shaming to her. I think we can understand why that would be difficult. But even before then, to present herself as a victim, not just to Mary, but to the entire world at large, and in many ways control the narrative around Mary. Even going so far as to fake endless letters. That could be nothing. That could be this defensiveness and feeling shamed. But I can't help wondering if deep down there was a guilt there about Mary's actions. A guilt Betty had that was too strong for her to dare feel, so it is instead projected all onto Mary. Both a guilt and this eagerness to consciously cover the truth, because there was a lot Betty did that she needed to keep hidden. She wanted this child child, the thing, taken away from her, and when it wasn't, she said about other methods. There are accounts of Mary's aunt or grandmother finding her on one occasion to have somehow gotten hold of and unscrewed a bottle of pills that was always kept at the back of a high-up cupboard. Mary's stomach had to be pumped in an emergency. Similarly, she and her brother were once given a bag of sweets to eat, only for the sisters to come back into the room a few minutes later and find the bag had been spilled onto the floor and that a bunch of little blue pills had been mixed into them. On another occasion, Mary's stomach was pumped, to which, half out of it, she managed to tell the doctors that her mother had fed her Smarties. Another account is of Betty attempting to throw Mary out of the window, only for another relative to catch her at the last moment. A lot of it sinister attempts to rid herself of her child, and it seems always Mary especially, several times giving her away, either to nearby neighbours that were concerned by Betty's parenting and had previously asked to take on Mary, or even on one occasion at an adoption centre. Betty had seen someone being rejected from the chance to adopt, so she had said, "I brought this one to be adopted, you have her," and walked off, letting this woman go out buying clothes for Mary and taking her home. Some of these events only prevented by other family members wanting to deal with it themselves and of course not involve the police or social services. They fetched Mary back. "Why did they do that?" she asked me, her voice childlike as it was to be repeatedly throughout the next days. "Why didn't they leave me with the lady who wanted a child?" Eventually, her family did become concerned to the point that they gave Betty something of an ultimatum and refused to speak to her at all any longer. And for all the world, it seemed as if Betty had then given up on trying to kill Mary and her brother. This ultimatum had done the trick. And again, we don't know really about the situation around her other siblings, who I have to wonder if they were taken in by their aunt at this point. But yeah, realising any more supposed accidents would be too suspicious, Betty settled on a different solution. Well, why didn't Betty want children? For a lot of reasons we probably won't know. There's far too little here to speculate on. However, the fact is it's always especially Mary. Especially this child who came from a different father that Betty never spoke of. Never told Mary and somewhat tortured her about it. The closest thing she got to an answer was once when Betty named one person who it seemed to just be a lie, and another when Mary asked her. By that time I decided it had to be something, really awful. I said, "Tell me, just tell me. Look, was it your father? Was it your brother? Is that why I became what I became?" And Betty had answered very quietly, "You are devil's spawn. That's what you are." And then she had stormed out. And it's not right to play a guessing game about someone's real experiences, but I can't help wonder if that's SA. It was Mary then a child that felt to Betty like a memory of that, something she then didn't want. I honestly don't know. The second reason is that Betty was a sex worker, specialising often as a dominatrix, and whilst she eventually could afford to go to Glasgow for work, she couldn't initially. Everything happened within their house, and in that sense, having a child becomes impractical for work. Is this a reason Betty wanted Mary to die? And then when Mary didn't, when the supposed accidents became risky, Mary was then instead included in Betty's work from as young as 4 years old. And I'm not going to quote any of these extracts from the book because it's incredibly uncomfortable to read. If you'd like to skip this section of the video, there is a timestamp here you can find in the description or in a pinned comment. I won't read out extracts, but there is a little I should describe now. I will say you can probably imagine a lot of what happened. I will say that when Betty was a dominatrix who used whips and various other punishments, Mary was left with scars. The one thing I do have to point out is Mary being choked to the point of losing consciousness. This one is important because both children, Martin and Brian, were strangled to death. Mary was regularly choked. But Betty tried to make it less unpleasant by making it sound like something of a game. I'd say tried to make it less unpleasant. This is abuse, Games such as Blind Man's Bluff, as they call it, where she'd be blindfolded and spun Mary in the air first, before Yeah, and Mary would be told that it wouldn't hurt, it was okay, it's alright, she wouldn't die. She would regain consciousness later to Betty or her clients telling her it's alright. These experiences are deeply, deeply damaging. All of it. Also impossible for a child to understand. As counsellors, you are meant to be on the lookout for sexual behaviour from a child as something that raises serious safeguarding concerns about this child being a victim of SA. Would an ordinary person have known that back in the 60s? Do people know it now? There was a man the family knew and trusted quite well called Harry. Once, when he'd fallen asleep from drink, Mary undid his trousers to see if he was the same as other men. Harry woke up with a start and stopped her in alarm, but then was careful not to scold her. And after that he tried to keep a protective watch out for Mary, but it seems he concluded Mary must have simply just walked in on her mother, rather than anything worse happening to her, so that's all he did. Either that, or it was just the complete culture of the time to be in absolute denial about SA, something that I think even today our culture is still struggling with. Mary ended up finding strangers on her own, going into their car and somewhat trying to turn herself from the victim into the aggressor by touching them, and then warning that she'd tell her dad, demanding she be paid in sweets for her silence. Again, this experience is just as awful. All of this is. And that man's house I mentioned earlier that Norma and Mary ran away to, he wanted something in return for letting them stay. There was a staff member also at the Red Bank secure unit she was moved to after the trial. On an occasion when she broke out of prison, someone who took her to a fairground then got her completely drunk and had sex, as well as some other dubious stories. Mary, I should make clear, was also on many occasions as a child beaten by her mother, near to the point of death. Once Betty even held her face under bath water, where Mary had to fight her way free to survive. In the context of all of this, the fact Betty so readily branded Mary to all of the community as a liar seems clear. There were many threats made about what would happen to Mary if she spoke out about the fact she wouldn't be believed, and above all, Mary felt it was her fault, that she deserved this, that she was, long before she ever murdered Martin Brown, a monster. As I say, the particular method of strangulation makes a lot more sense in the context of everything we've just discussed there. In fact, the story of attempting to strangle Pauline in the sand pits after a fight, and then starting to shove sand and her fingers into her mouth, that makes sense too. This, again, is only one aspect of it, but still there is some attempt within those crimes to make sense of what happened to her. This child, who simply could not understand it, was trying to perhaps reframe herself not as the victim, not as the one who felt weak and helpless, but to try and understand what her mother felt as the perpetrator, or those clients, to understand why they do it. These acts her mother told her was just a game. None of this is even mentioning general effects of trauma on the brain and on a child's behaviour, things I think I've discussed in previous videos. I don't want to bloat this video even longer than it's going to be by repeating a lot of that, but is it any wonder Mary was left very prone to aggression in situations where a stress response went into overload, in other situations quite possibly dissociating and left cold, blank, dead inside? The biggest question, however, is what does a child, or this child, understand of death? What does it mean? Generally, children do struggle to understand the finality of death. They can get that somebody is gone, but also sort of imagine they might come back, that it's reversible. It's not they're incapable of understanding the rational concept, it's a struggle to grasp the weight of it. I'd imagine particularly so if they're told their pets have gone to live on a farm, or their pets are endlessly replaced, as actually happened for Mary. You know, my dog, my Alsatian, He had died 2 or 3 times, I think, but I can't really remember because each time my dad brought me the same dog the next day. The full weight of death isn't an easy thing for anyone to want to reflect on and want to grasp. I think it's relevant also that she had no family members die before. Death wasn't something she'd come into contact with beyond what she'd heard or what she'd seen on TV through cartoons or films about Jesse James or whatever else. So would she understand? It's a good question, and I think it'd be wrong to give a resounding no, she couldn't possibly have understood at that age. I think if she was younger, you could probably say that. I think, generally they say it's between the ages of 5 and 12 that children are coming to understand the finality of death. There's not a clear-cut point or anything. Mary, who was 10 at the time of the killings, later talked a lot in interviews about not really seeing it as death, and maybe you could argue she's making excuses, but I don't think she is. I find it perfectly believable for a 10-year-old child, especially one who was deeply traumatised, has never had experiences of bereavement, who has been getting carried away with the fantasy, with 2 friends egging each other on, with all sorts of excitable fantasies about murder, a child who was regularly choked to the point of losing consciousness and told that that was part of the game, that she wouldn't die, that was okay, she'll come back, and she did, every time she woke up again. For her to then strangle to death 2 children, knowing on some rational level that she was killing them, but also not quite recognising the reality of that. Why wouldn't they wake up just the same as I did? Much has been made in other videos and documentaries about Mary and Norma grinning, going round to the home of Martin Brown and asking his mum, is he there? And his mother saying, no pet, he's dead, only for Mary to respond, oh, I know, I wanted to see his coffin, and still grinning. A lot is made of that as a twisted, taunting mind game to appall and horrify his mother, and that's certainly not an interpretation to discredit. Norma and Mary had been daring each other to go and knock on the door and speak to his mother, so they knew there was something wrong with what they were doing. Also, however Mary came to be when growing older and when away from this environment, and however questionable I might find it at that age, she was given a diagnosis that suggested psychopathy, so those factors are all true. And yet, I also don't think we should discount exactly why Mary might want to see Martin Brown. Why she might want to see and recognise that, yes, he's not coming back, he is dead, it is permanent. And whilst that grinning and sort of playful approach to all of this certainly looks and is callous, is this also something she's still unable to grasp the seriousness of? Likely wanting to view it as a kind of joke, that it's a trick, that he's going to spring to life any moment, shielding herself from the fear by making it something exciting again. Personally, this strikes me less as someone relishing the pleasure of tormenting Martin's mother than someone half attempting to recognise and half protecting herself from the weight of her actions at the same time. I think we could probably take a similar view of Mary rubbing her hands and cheering at Brian's funeral, a sort of manic, he's not dead, he's about to come back now, this is the moment, except, of course, he doesn't. The finality increasingly starts to sink in, and when the reality, the horror of it all does become apparent, becomes much less a fun dare to talk about with Norma, suddenly Mary can no longer bear to think about it. She starts to deny to herself that she killed anyone at all. I think because of Mary's very obvious intelligence, it becomes difficult for people to recognise that doesn't mean her brain has fully developed, and I think we all know how difficult the finality of death can be. Like, sometimes I can almost forget for a second that my nan died this year. Many of you will know about our house rabbit Lennon, who we had to have put down several months ago. For a week or so after, we'd somewhat look over and expect her to still be there with Hendrix, and almost feel like she's not gone, It's not rational, but it's a feeling, and particularly for children, or particularly under enough stress, those feelings can have more impact on your rational view. You see that when she discusses the trial and tries to remember how she felt, that all the way through it, she worried she was going to be hanged. Obviously the classic method of execution, and one she would have seen in films and things, but it's also strangulation, essentially. That idea scares her, but even then, it isn't something final. There's the sort of uneasy uncertainty about what happens next, what happens with my life after the hanging. And this in itself is an interesting quote that details what terrified her most wasn't the sentence itself, but Well, in one aspect, the way the jurors looked at her, or the lawyers, their eyes, the shame, but also this. You know, all the time it was going on, what I was most frightened of was that the lawyers were going to tell everybody that they'd see him where I had been for most of the time of the remand. I had had a fight with a girl and called her a prostitute. Miss Alexander, who had been head there, had said that she had to write reports on everything I did, so I was frightened the lawyers would ask me how I knew what a prostitute was. That was the most frightening thing of all to me. That meant something to me, you see? Everything else really didn't. You were more frightened of that than the idea of their hanging you. That was all part of the unreal, you know, the other side. The prostitute thing was real. I think that quite well illustrates the difference between something that feels abstract and not quite tangible and something that, well, we know why that terrifies her. We know the truth that lurks beneath the prostitute comments. As the interviews go on, Gitta Sereny knows a time is going to come where she needs to ask Mary directly about the murders, to get her to talk through them clearly. Something Mary finds incredibly difficult to do because the horror. For most of her life she came to insist that she hadn't killed them, not just lying to people, but denial. She absolutely felt that. Gradually, she began to recognise that she had killed Martin Brown, but still insisted it was an accident, her memories altering to protect her, and then gradually to recognise that she had killed Brian too, and eventually that neither of them were accidents. Something that even in these interviews is still incredibly distressing for her to say, but she needs to. She wants to. And I'm going to read some quotes about that, most of them from different sections of the interviews, and I don't think Mary's distress is conveyed when you fragment them. I also think the fragmentation should make it less uncomfortable and painful to read and present to you now than the whole thing was to read in its entirety when I read it yesterday, because it really is an uncomfortable read, and there are timestamps here to skip past these quotes if you want. But to read some quotes. Martin was already in the yard, but I thought of, play dead. A game? I asked. No, I didn't think it was a game. I just thought, I'm not really hurting you. I'll lie down with you. And I did. I'm not going to hurt you, not really, I said. But we'll go to heaven. I told him to put his hands on my throat, and I put my hands on his. I stayed. It seemed for hours, she continued. So long, I don't know, I might have fallen asleep, but still no one came. I don't remember any voices. Do you remember coming back to yourself? No, I remember only being on the outside. It wasn't long before there was a lot of commotion. I remember thinking, if I'd stayed a little longer, they would have found me and Martin, and I would have come alive and would have been taken away, and everyone would have understood. But you knew you weren't dead, really. Did you know Martin was dead? Not dead. Not really dead, just unconscious. Unconscious, like I had been unconscious. I think, to me, it was, you'll come round in time for tea. Do you know why you did it, Mary? I asked her. Were you angry? Can you try to tell me what you felt when you pressed Martin's throat? Angry. Her voice was muffled, talking into her lap. I'm not angry. It isn't a feeling. It's a void that comes, happens, opens. It's an abyss. It's beyond rage, beyond pain. It's black cotton wool. She paused. The crying too had stopped. Is there an urge? It's like a light being switched off, without your knowing it's been on. It's like a train behind you. You have to walk. You have to keep walking, but there's no noise. Not even your heartbeat. Sometimes, if you're frightened, as I had been before, you feel your heartbeat very strongly, but not even that. Muddy waters. Yeah, that's still really difficult to read. I'm conscious that you could take all of this section for me to be saying, well, a kid doesn't know what they're doing, it's nothing, which isn't what I'm saying. I think as chilling as it is, that quote about the void, the black cotton wool, it's important to include for that reason. There is still the trauma, still the disturbed state Mary felt herself within. This isn't just someone who didn't understand, this is someone who wasn't able to understand and wasn't able to process everything, this beyond pain. This is someone pushed on all sides by extreme pressures, spiralling further and further away, and then an awful, irreversible, indelible moment like this. It's both of those things. And here's a short quote talking about Brian Howe. I touched his face. She touched her own face as she spoke. His eyes weren't open. He wasn't getting up, and so I used one hand and closed his throat. So it was actually you who killed him, I said. She didn't answer. She had said it, and she could not say it again. And then she said, Norma began laughing hysterically, and there were weeds and tall flowers. I covered him over with the bulrushes. And then she told of how they had come back later, with a razor blade and scissors. And in their statements, Norma had said one thing and Mary had said another. So who would have cut his hair? I asked her. Yes, and trying to cut his penis. I don't think I need to elaborate on that point. I think we can understand quite clearly why Mary would try to do that. What's interesting is in the interviews how Mary completely forgets she said it. Gitta asks her again about Brian Howe a few weeks later to see if the story is recounted the same, and it mostly is until this point. When you told me about this before, you said you tried to cut his penis. I didn't say that. Yes, you did. No. The razor blade and the marks on his tummy, and my initials, you know. But you said it was Norma who put that. Yes. Then I asked what you did with the scissors, and after a long hesitation you said, I tried to cut his penis, but it wasn't successful. Do you remember? Mary can't remember this at all. She has to read Gitta's notes from that earlier interview, and then even has to go out and call her husband to see what she'd said before. No, that's right, I wouldn't have invented that. God, no, I must have. You were very upset. I mean to remember. To sit here and say, yes, I said that. I'm so shocked, because why would I forget saying something so horrid as that? So horrid to me. I don't really like reading these quotes out. I'm increasingly feeling not just it's incredibly emotional for me to read them, but I think there's the danger it feels something insincere about doing that, about me trying to voice them. I don't know, I'd be interested in your comments on that. I guess I just wanted to leave that as one example for how, even now, Mary's memory can be fractured by the ways the mind might try to defend you from psychological distress. On 4 different occasions they go through the story of Martin Brown, and each time Mary is recounting it slightly different. Not because she's lying, but this is how memory can work, particularly for the things we find most distressing. And this is one of those things you don't often try to contemplate, you know? Maybe because this isn't my area of specialty. I've worked with children who have witnessed murder or have had loved ones killed, but not children who have committed it before. Perhaps that lack of understanding shows in this video, but to try and think how horrifying it would feel to be aware that you had done that as a child for no rational reason, to have that in your mind. The shame as well, how much easier it might be to shut it off, or even to feel nothing. That's kind of rambling conjecture, but I suppose it's to say that coming to feel guilt and remorse was a journey for Mary Bell in many ways. A struggle with the overwhelming and unbearable reality, and one that she had to deal with in the 60s and 70s, where a lot of it was hindered rather than helped by the system around her. And it makes me wonder if that would be better today. Would the psychiatrists in prisons be better today? Would things have been spotted sooner? There are other more recent cases similar to Mary, but can others develop as she appears to have developed? Perhaps even better? I'd like to hope so. Therapy has made massive leaps in the last 60 odd years. Where will it be in another 60? Let's talk briefly about Red Bank. Red Bank Special Unit is a secure part of what was, in 1969, still referred to as an approved school. But in the early 1970s, the relevant government departments were beset with battles between the adherents of 2 opposing styles of approach. One might say the disciplinarians and the carers. It was then that approved schools as institutions for children who were hard to manage or who had offended against the law, calling forth images of isolation and Victorian methods of discipline, became ideologically unacceptable and were renamed community homes. After a period of the law not really knowing what to do with a child as young as Mary, she was eventually sent to Red Bank, which, rather than describing all of it as it was as an institution, I think it's better to understand the man who ran it at the time, named James Dixon. Someone who was ex-Navy and believed in things being ship-shape, a very clear structure and order to the lives of everyone there, rigid routines, doors unlocked and locked when passing through, no children left unsupervised except in their bedrooms, and even then someone was on patrol outside. James Dixon was a man of clear order, I suppose is the point there, and very strong principles of absolute honesty and fair treatment, but above all, an incredibly loving man. Mary speaks of him with endless warmth all throughout the book. Everyone else Gitta spoke to found him to be a wonderful and genuinely inspiring man who devoted his life to trying to help these kids, and it seems in a lot of important ways he was successful in this. The vast majority of this video, I can only go on the evidence this book states, so, we don't know, but it sounds like he was a great, deeply caring man, with the one downside attributed to him by two of the other staff named Ben and Carol. They suggested that he was perhaps a little naive. He knew that many of these kids were very disturbed. Some of the boys probably quite as badly as Mary, but he thought that love conquers all, and of course it can do a lot. Or let's say without the atmosphere that he created at Red Bank, nothing can be done, but all the love in the world can't give people like us the skill to help children unlock their troubled minds. For that you need teaching and training. For Mary to come as far as she does, I would guess her early childhood couldn't have been completely without love and care. As far as we can tell, her aunts and uncles appear to be mostly normal people. She had a close relationship to her grandmother, and I think to her stepfather. I feel wary there because you don't want to fall into the split of one good parent and one bad, but there are some warm memories in the book of Billy Bell trying to comfort her or cheer up Mary, and on one occasion where Betty said Mary needed beating, Billy took her upstairs and told Mary to jump up and down and make it sound as though she was being hit rather than actually doing it, which, isn't standing up and disagreeing with his wife there. It's not challenging that. I think I then can't help but wonder how much Billy turned a blind eye to at home, but all the same it does suggest at least more care than Betty. He also consistently visited her all throughout her time at Red Bank and appears to have had a genuine connection with her. That said, he was also regularly absent from her life, sometimes obviously in prison, and then when Mary went to prison, he didn't visit her there at all, not for any of the years. Perhaps because of his experiences with prison, perhaps it would have hurt him to see her there like he had been. I don't know, and neither did Mary, quite sadly. She never asked him. Which, on absolute conjecture, we could wonder if Mary had somewhat succumbed to all of his absences. Felt she didn't have the right for him to visit, maybe didn't deserve it, I don't know. All the same, James Dixon, as well as other staff at Red Bank, definitely offered Mary some very genuine feelings of love that she had lacked and very much needed for her development. And the quote is right, you can't do anything without love. All therapy survives on a foundation of an authentic and caring relationship, and it does seem James Dixon nurtured that kind of environment for Red Bank, which would be incredibly hard to do. On the one hand, all of it is absolutely vital, loving but also with important structure there too. The way many of the staff talk though, they saw Mary as a daughter or a sister, and she saw them as parents, particularly James Dixon. He is a heroic figure in her life. It is hard, if not impossible, to overcome feelings of shame enough to allow yourself to feel guilt without first experiencing love. On the other hand, it seems a lot of the staff had trouble keeping enough of a professional distance with Mary, which again doesn't mean you're supposed to be cold and distant to her. You have to be seeking to reach them. but you also have to look after yourself, I guess, and be aware of what dynamics you might be getting pulled into, be aware of what's healthy and what's not. Mary had an incredible, exhausting need that at times could leave the staff drained, or leave them feeling that she was becoming possessive, or even manipulative does crop up as a word used on occasion here. But I think need is the right word, and I think this is quite an apt quote from one of the teachers there. There is in her an extraordinary inner intensity, a neediness one can neither really understand nor handle, and most of us feel we fail with her because, not understanding what it is she so desperately needs, we can't give it to her. That's where the sense of failure comes in. There's a guilt a lot of them seem to feel, which then leads to them investing more and more in her, and sometimes then wearing themselves thin. A guilt which would be incredibly meaningful in itself to understand Mary, what that might mean in the counter-transference, but they just weren't equipped for that. And we can say, well, this was the 60s, 70s, but also devoting so much time to Red Bank, wouldn't you want to take steps to learn and train as much as you possibly could? And I think one of the other problems is that the more they came to deeply invest in Mary, the more they fell into believing that she was innocent of her crimes. The way Mary felt she was, they fell into the same sort of denial about this wonderfully vibrant, intelligent girl who, again, wasn't just manipulating them to feel close. There was genuine affection both ways. But it became too difficult to believe that she had killed, and that fostered an environment that then encouraged denial. But Mary had killed. Mary needed to come to terms with that, and you can't come to terms with something you deny. Like, don't get me wrong, you can't force her to, that would make it worse, but you have to at least facilitate or allow space for her to start to think about it. Carol recounts a memory of Mary. She suddenly said to me, "Don't you worry about being in the room on your own with me." It quite shook me. The inference being, of course, who she was, and I said at once, of course not. And it didn't. This, as one simple example, might have been an interesting chance to open up a little bit of that space about what Mary feels there. Like, I don't mean Carol should have been saying, yes, it scares me, that would have been even worse, but to help her think about that, to question further what Mary's feeling there. On one occasion where Mary does seem on the cusp of starting to recognise, James Dixon, it would appear based on the book's telling, then put a stop to this. In an art lesson, Mary had started ripping off scraps of paper and writing little bits on them. "And what did you write? About Martin, and about Brian, and Norma?" "I wrote that I'd killed Martin. And that was the first time I'd said it." "Did you write how you killed Martin?" I asked. She shook her head. "No. Oh no, I said it was an accident." "And did you say that you killed Brian?" She shook her head. Mr. Dixon essentially came in and saw these scraps of notes, took her to his office only to tell her that she could run along, and presumably he binned the note, never to speak of it again. And there's another event of Betty's, I think, first or second visit to Red Bank, and Mary asking her, I said, "What did I do? Why did I do it?" And she said, in that hard voice she often had, "I don't want to know. Don't talk about it. Don't ever talk about it to no one." And she'd only been there a minute and a half, and she got up, and she didn't walk, she ran out of the room with her blonde wig flying out of the building. And I didn't see her then for months. Which is why it's not enough when people just say, oh, she was a child, she didn't know what she was doing, because, yes, but she still did that, you know? It's something she did, and all of her feelings about that fact are there inside her. No amount of excusing or denial or anything is going to erase that. It's there. I suppose even regardless of, faults or blame or that stuff, she needs to be able to feel guilt about it. She needs to feel in general. And even this early on, you can tell Mary does want to make sense of it, does want to recognise the truth deep down, but it's so scary. Most of the people there had a genuine love for Mary, but was it for all of Mary? Did she feel that they'd still love her if they really knew what she'd done? You know, that they can only love her if they pretend she's innocent, like she's got this dark, unspoken monster deep down, buried somewhere, but if they saw that, they'd hate her. That sort of feeling. Therapy work is about caring for all of a person, the good and the bad, recognising all of it, and sometimes challenging them, definitely not excusing things, but always maintaining empathy. And so whilst an evaluation was carried out on Mary by Dr. Westbury in 1971 that essentially concluded he had found her remarkably improved, with a loss of nearly all her aggressive tendencies, a modification of her inclination to manipulate, and an improvement in her relationships with other people. It even spoke of an eventual release date. Despite all of that being true, Mary, though, still had a hell of a long way to go. And one stark indicator is that Mary consistently wets the bed throughout her life. All throughout Red Bank and all throughout her time in prison. This is commonly thought about as one of the indicators that could lead to, for example, psychopathy. Although we should clarify this is only bedwetting in her sleep, as far as I can tell, and that it is not a direct link to things like psychopathy at all. It can mean numerous things. It's better to look at it in connection to trauma and stress. We can't be sitting here diagnosing someone, but I've often talked, I think, particularly in my Katie series, about this importance of caring for all of a person. Mary had a relationship with an unnamed man towards the end of her time in prison. A man, it seems, who fell in love with her when she was in prison, and the details of how this happened are quite lacking, making it hard to tell how genuine or creepy as hell it all is, especially when he invited her to stay with him for her first home leave. It's very much a questionable relationship, and she ended up getting pregnant and needing an abortion from this, which is quite a moving section of the story. However, within all of it, he'd say, "I love you for whatever you've done, for all your bad points and your good points. It was amazing for me." It is certainly significant that in the course of this relationship, that for the first time since she was 4 or 5, she ceased to be anuretic. "I couldn't believe it had stopped," she said. "It had been with me forever, it seemed, and suddenly it was gone. I was clean." There's something really quite heartwarming about that, in spite of what reads as a very questionable relationship, and in spite of the context of everything. I think this again reflects feelings of someone who had grown up always feeling like a monster, and then did something that only enhanced that feeling. There's so much we haven't discussed about Red Bank. I haven't discussed the SA, which shows another side of Red Bank, and the denial the staff had about it. I haven't mentioned that Mary was the only girl there. Plans were set in place by James Dixon for Mary to go on from Red Bank and get further education and learn a trade within supervised limits, something that probably would have been great for her. However, the law decided instead, upon turning 16, despite Mr. Dixon fighting them about it for months, that she was to be sent instead to prison. The youngest prisoner in all of Style Prison. Her experiences there undoubtedly hindered a lot of her progress, and that could probably be an entire video in itself, because there's so much to discuss there, but I'm going to add one quite insightful quote about it from Mary. "One thing that one has to face in prison is that you are not there to be helped, you are there to be punished. Like for old Mary Scorse, the time of your crime and the feelings that made you commit are so far away, you may not even remember them. Certainly, most people try not to remember, so if you are being punished, it is finally for being, not for doing. Do you know what I mean? And many people, women probably more than men, give into it, and as they won't or can't remember the perhaps one occasion where they wronged, they then just come to agree, come to feel that they are bad. My mother always told me I was bad, as long as I could remember. Mr. Dixon told me I wasn't, but slowly, or perhaps not even slowly, that reassurance disappeared." I think that's such a wonderful quote. Of course they don't sit there reflecting on their crime, wanting to remember it. Being in prison is all about surviving prison, and that could feed denial or avoidance. And I think she's right. The shame of it quite often eats away at your belief in the possibility of ever being a better person. In that sense, you do have to wonder what all of this punishment is even for. I'll go out on a limb and say I think even now the British prison system is an absolute mess. I've never worked in one, so yes, that limits my opinion, but I do know a few people who do. Carol suggests that losing the battle over Mary, her being sent to prison, that somewhat broke James Dixon. He was broken up about losing her. He just sat there, looking awful. He died a year and a half afterwards, and to be honest, we always thought that losing the battle for her affected his health. The news of this massively affected Mary too. It is really sad. But I think even this in itself details the problems with staff being under-equipped. This video hasn't been about any of those things though. I don't want to stretch it longer getting lost in this stuff. In many ways, I think we've already kind of hit the conclusion, but I am going to set aside another section for it nonetheless. Arguably, I think there is a single terrifying fact at the centre of this book. When we look at society today, not just in Britain, because it is quite a similar fact in other countries too, it's that the criminal age of responsibility is now 10 years old in the UK. That's shocking, right? That has to be shocking. To be fair, I don't think I've demonstrated why enough in this video. The whole, account of the trial and the effect it had on Mary and Norma, the penal system afterwards. So many of those criticisms that this book makes still hold up today, despite this being written in the 90s. So I feel I should just at least mention that. But I've made 2 videos now that you could loosely say are in a true crime genre. However, I think it's unlikely this is going to become a thing on my channel. It's still not a subject that generally tends to interest me personally. I had never heard of Mary Bell at all until a therapist I know, infinitely more experienced than me, briefly told me about her life and said, if you wanted to read about it, be careful what you read, here is a good starting place for a book. There's nothing wrong with true crime, obviously, don't get me wrong, Kirsty is fascinated by these kind of stories, and I think there's a lot of meaning to take away from them, even in the instances where they are a bit dramatised. I also don't think it's bad when other therapists or psychologists or whoever make videos on real people. I don't judge them for that, I just know it's something I feel uneasy about doing myself, even if I now have. Although this video wasn't so much my analysis, was it, compared to other videos? I mean, I've got my points here in places, but I think I wanted to stick to more relaying Mary's words, letting them express everything, because this is a real person, you know? Perhaps also the fact I read the entire 150,000-ish words book yesterday in a mad frenzy. It's pretty much the only thing I did all of yesterday, and I made all of my notes and recorded this today. It's all still, as a result, buzzing around my head, to the extent it'll probably be another week or 2 before I suddenly start thinking of all the extra stuff that would have been great to say in this video. If I was smart, I'd have taken more time to make this, but I know I have a busy week ahead of me now. I didn't release a video last week, and I need something out for the sake of my finances. And I was just suddenly very passionate to talk about this. Once I'm passionate about the video, I find it really hard to shelve it for a week or 2 in place of doing something else, you know? The video about Mary Bell has loosely been in my head ever since I was told about her, and then when I just started reading the book, I couldn't stop. So yes, that's what I've done. All of that tangent aside, I think the reason it's unlikely I'll make another video on other true crime stories is because this video kind of says all I want to say about that subject as a whole, and I might be wrong about this because I'm hardly well versed in true crime or any of that kind of stuff, but it feels to me like there can be this split between either seeing someone as evil or as the victim, effectively, rather than the messy and nuanced confusions between. You could frame Mary Bell as evil for something she did when she was 10 years old, or you could frame her as a victim, in which case often people then view the mum as pure evil without seeking to understand her at all either, which we could do. There are some meaningful things described about her in this book. I don't know, it's almost like you end up in a debate, either in the videos or the comment sections, about who's good and who's bad, trying to split into these camps. A debate that I feel like misses the point in stories where no one is the winner, and where there's probably so much more to the stories than just the singular events of the murder, the build-up to it, and what the sentence was. I think true crime can end up sort of encapsulating people within a specific point in time, not just the perpetrators, but the victims and the affected families too, like they're frozen there. And that's fine, because all of that is important to talk about, but it's what's beyond that really that interests me personally, which is what's special about this book, Cries Unheard, because it isn't about Mary committing a murder, it is about Mary trying to come to terms with the fact she committed a murder, about trying to build a life beyond it. I'd be equally interested in stories from the other perspective of someone coming to terms with losing a loved one to murder or narrowly surviving and their struggle with that. Not the frozen, fixed moment in time itself, but the battle to go further. Trauma in general can leave you feeling like you're trapped in that past moment, and ironically, it's a bit like these stories often do that too, you know? To me, the important questions aren't what happened and who did it, but why it could happen, and then where the world goes from there. That requires the endeavour to understand Mary, right? To try, at least, all of her. The traumatised girl that you feel for and see as this innocent victim, the killer that scares you and leaves you feeling that she's evil, and then all of the many things in between those two extremes. This story isn't an uplifting one of someone, like, reaching some idealised happy place in life. It's not meant to be anything like that. Mary is still very troubled. Her husband needs an incredible strength and patience to support her, and it details Mary quite often falling into bouts of depression and guilt that she'll probably struggle with for the rest of her life. And yet she is out there. The true conclusion is that there can't be a conclusion. Mary Bell is out there under a different identity, and with any luck, we'll never hear anything more about her at all in the news. You know, that's absolutely the best way this story ends, not with an answer, not with something where we can say, yes, this is the understanding to all of it, but the realisation things keep on going far past our scope. They live. The book ends quite sharply with the question, do we believe a released prisoner, above all a lifer, whose release is always and everywhere accompanied by special regulations, has regained the right to a normal working and family life? Do we in fact believe in redemption? Do you? Is a question. In general, let me know your thoughts about any of the stuff in this video, what I've missed, what I've got wrong, some of the controversial elements to this book, because it is controversial. I haven't really touched on that enough here. All the same, I would thoroughly recommend reading the book. There is like 4 times the videos I could make about the stuff in it. You have to know it is very, very uncomfortable to read in places though. Maybe I would talk more about it if there was enough interest. I deliberately wanted this conclusion section to feel a bit rambly in the hopes that makes it feel more like downtime after what is quite a dark and difficult video, so I hope this section has somewhat helped. Like the video if you liked it, subscribe, maybe even support me on Patreon, yeah, but otherwise, hopefully see you next time. And as ever, a special thank you goes to Luke Hoare, Treat You Caber, Michael Gallagher, Flying Spider, Kellyanne Davidson, Billy Lee Myers Jr., Samara Salsey, Joshua C. Follier, Chad Bramwell and Michael Hart. Thank you.